Hey, party people, I'm Lia Scholl, pastor of First Friends Meeting in beautiful Greensboro, North Carolina. Thank you for taking time to be with me here today. Today, we're talking about the prophets. So be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. In churches all across the Western world, preachers will preach about prophets in the Bible. They will speak of them as if they are special people, specially called by God to do a particular work. Some will say they have delusions of grandeur. Some will say they are soothsayers and fortune tellers. Some will say that they are people with imaginations run wild. What we think about the prophets has far more to do with what we think about God than what we think about the prophets. Abraham Joshua Heschel, arguably the greatest Jewish theologian of our ages, insisted that in order to appreciate the prophets, one must first reject philosophical views which render the idea of God's pathos, the inner emotional life of God, unthinkable and even embarrassing. Heschel says that the biblical God is neither distant nor impersonal, nor an all-powerful lawgiver demanding obedience. Instead, God is profoundly concerned with human behavior and history, and indeed as vulnerable in a very real sense to human affairs. Human actions affect God, bringing God grief, anger, or joy, and strengthening or diminishing God's presence in the world. This isn't an imperfection in God. Instead, God's vulnerability defines God's relationship with humans. In other words, God is intimately involved in the world and in humanity, which for Heschel means that God is not some object out there to be known, but instead, it is God who bestows meaning on everything, including the human self. In other words, there is a center of meaning apart from and beyond our minds. And to the prophet, God doesn't reveal God's self in the abstract, but in a personal and intimate way. This is a dynamic relationship between God and humanity, not feeling or affection, but a passionate summons. Abraham Joshua Heschel was himself a prophet. His daughter said, "The prophets know that unless we understand the very depths of corruption, misery, and despair, the hope we offer is superficial. Only the prophet who gives voice to the silent agony, who rages against injustice, whose passion exudes from every word, can offer true hope that evil is never the climax of history, that redemption will come." I had this interesting thought about the prophets this week. It is that they never rally the people to war. They warn of war, but they never rally the people to war. They never even prepare the people for war. They constantly call the people to behavior that would prevent war. Like the prophet Isaiah, who says, "Many peoples shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that God may teach us their ways, and that we may walk in their paths.' God shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. The people shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." The prophets paint a picture of a warless world, a world where people follow God's way into peace. And that hope of the prophets is that there will be no more war, and that's the good news. The bad news is it's our job to do it. So far, as humans, we have not shown a proclivity towards peace. You likely have heard that quote from Edmund Burke: "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." And while those are very good and alarming words, he said more than just that. He said, while people are linked together, they easily and speedily communicate the alarm of any evil design. They are enabled to fathom it with common counsel and to oppose it with united strength. Whereas when they lie dispersed, without concert, order, or discipline, communication is uncertain, counsel difficult, and resistance impractical. Where people are not acquainted with each other's principles, nor experienced in each other's talents, nor at all practiced in their mutual habitudes and dispositions by joint efforts in business, no personal confidence, no friendship, no common interest subsisting among them, it is evidently impossible that they can act a public part with uniformity, perseverance, or efficacy. When bad people combine, the good must associate, else they will fail, one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle. You get this? The only way, really, to face evil in our world is to know each other and to care for one another. What does it mean to know each other? I think we can start with a single thought, that we are all human and all have similar needs and wants. As Sting sang in the 80s, the Russians love their children too. If we refuse to make enemies out of any human or any group, and even more, refuse to other one another, then we admit that all of us deserve basic human rights and beyond. That also means that we understand our own need to be heard, which means that we must listen deeply. Listen, as the prophets do, to God, and listen to others. We must be, as Edmund Burke says, acquainted with each other's principles, experienced in each other's talents. Then we must admit that all of us, experienced in others' talents, practiced in their mutual habitudes and dispositions by joint efforts. We must practice confidence, friendship, common interest, and living together. Prophets, as Godly Play says, are people who come so close to God that they know what God wants. God wants us to love each other, not just our friends, but our enemies too. As we move into waiting worship, I ask that you consider this query: with whom do you need to become acquainted? I love you, and I love being your pastor.